My first question to you is, how did you get started into radio? You started in radio in 1969. How did you get into radio?
Well, I was attracted to radio coming out of high school because of what I was hearing on the air in 1966, 67, and 68. Mm-hmm. And against my mother's best wishes, she asked me, "What would you like to be a doctor? No. Lawyer? No. How about a midshipman?" We grew up in Annapolis. And I said, too much math, no thank you. She said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, let me get back to you. And I thought about it for a while. And I think I'd already been through 2 semesters at the University of Maryland in College Park, where I met other people. And I said, I think I want to be in radio. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, like on the air." She said, "Well, I have a friend who owns one of the radio stations in Annapolis. I can set up an appointment. You go talk to him and find out what it'll take." Okay. And I said, "Okay." So this was WANN and WXTC, and the gentleman's name was Maury, Maury, Blum, Blum. And I went out to see Maury, and he said, "So, young man, you think you want to be in radio?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." He says, "Well, in order to be in radio, you need your FCC first-class license." And I said, "I don't know what that is." And, he described that there was a third class, a second class, and a first-class license. And in order to get a job in radio, you had to usually start in small markets where there were stations with directional arrays that changed at sunrise and sunset. Mm-hmm. And in order to operate the radio station, the announcers at that time had to have these technical licenses. And the technical licenses were there so that they could, with some assurance, take the transmitter readings every hour. Mm-hmm. And it was especially important for the small markets because they typically had more directionality issues, and things had to be right. So you had to have this, what they called a first-class FCC ticket. And I went to 2 different trade schools, and I got that ticket, the first-class ticket. Mm-hmm. After getting the third class and the second class ticket, got my first job in October of 1969 at WLMD AM in Laurel, Maryland, between Baltimore and Washington. Mm-hmm. Went from there to WNAV in Annapolis, was there for a year, and after WNAV, I went to WAYE in Baltimore, which was a big jump to go from Annapolis to Baltimore. Mm-hmm. I spent a year at WAYE AM in Baltimore, and then went to WHFS FM in Washington, D.C. I was there for 2.5 years. Mm-hmm. Briefly went to WEAM AM, back to WLMD, and then I got a wonderful offer from a woman who was at DC 101 in Washington as afternoon drive and music director. She had been hired by WBAL FM in Baltimore, which was a 50,000-watt FM station with a union contract. Mm-hmm. And she said, "I'm putting a rock format on the air up there. It's going to be called 98 Rock. And it's going to be similar to what we do here in D.C., but it's going to be tweaked for the Baltimore market." Well, WBAL was the clear channel 50,000-watt AM station in Baltimore, and this was their FM, and they had a TV station downstairs. Mm-hmm. So all owned by the Hearst Corporation. So this was time. So at halfway through my career, 8.5 years into my radio career, I began working for really top-flight broadcasting in Baltimore, and I was there for 8.5 years before leaving in 1986. I was always on the air at all of these radio stations. And I was usually the production director, which meant that I wrote, created, and voiced and produced commercials and radio sounders, and did a little engineering here and there. That ended in 1986.
Yeah. So you had a long career in radio, and do you ever think about going back into radio?
Well, I tried not to. I looked for opportunities to get back into it, but I saw that, I guess the thing that that lit me up most was, at that point in time, in the mid-'80s, in Baltimore and Washington, there was a very lucrative market in freelance voice work. There was a lot of commercial work and non-commercial work. Non-broadcast narration is what it was called, for corporate industrial training and marketing and stuff like that. And I seemed to have a voice and an understanding of how to say the words that attracted me to people. I mean, it was not easy. You had to go out and, make the contacts, have a demo put together of the different kinds of reads that you would do for one job or the other, and get them out there so that people could hear them and then go yes or no. And even if it was yes, then, they may not have a job for you today, but at some point in the future, they may take a chance and bring you in to see what you could do. And that happened for me. And at some point, I was making a really, really nice money from somewhere between 86 and 2004, just driving from a recording studio to recording studio in Baltimore and Washington with copy under my arm, and I'd walk in and they'd go into the studio and set a mic up in front of me, and I'd go blah, blah, blah. They'd go, thank you very much, and we'll send you a check, and I'd be out the door. So at that point, why do radio? Radios, you're stuck in a small room with a console and a bunch of tape machines and buttons, and you're reading lines off of cards, because they don't want you to be particularly creative at this point in radio. And this just felt a lot freer and a lot more creative.
Yeah. Well, the entertainment business is creative, it is very creative. There's many different things to get involved in it. If it's radio, voice acting, on-camera acting, it's very interesting, And,
yeah, and I had the writing ability, I had the technical ability to make the recordings, the audio recordings, and I had the performance capability. And along the way, I added video shooting and editing. I remember a friend of mine, this was in like 2004 or 6, I guess, and I said, I need to start thinking about shooting video and editing it, and I'm terrified. And he said, well, I'll lend you my camera and tripod. And I said, okay. So the camera sat on the tripod in my living room for like 3 days, and I would walk around it and look at it and think, so many buttons, I don't know what to do. And finally, it was on the day of one of the presidents was getting signed in, Inauguration Day. And I got up that day, and for whatever reason, I said, this is the day. So I set up the camera, I sat at the dining room table, and I plugged in my location audio recorder because, again, having evolved out of radio in 86, between then and 2004, I also became interested in location audio for video and film shoots. And this was done with a special mixer, with special, with boom microphones and lavaliers. And I gravitated to them. And because of my engineering background, I very easily understood how and where and why to use them. So what I did on that inauguration day was set up my mixer on the table, and set up the camera, and check it to make sure that I was in frame. And I plugged 4 different microphones into the 4 inputs of that mixer and did a 12-minute talk about which mics to use for which occasions. And if you go up on the internet today and Google Ty Ford mic tutorial, you'll find that video. That was my very first training video back in the day when I had evolved from radio.
Interesting. Very interesting and amazing.
So now I'd evolved. Now I'd spilled into shooting video and editing video, and it was still writing, still doing voice work when it happened. Although the market got plundered. I don't know if you're interested in that kind of content, but I've got a description of what happened to the voiceover market if you want that in the article.
Yeah, you could say that. Go ahead. You can.
Okay. So this is what happened to the voiceover industry. Well, the voiceover industry in Baltimore and Washington in the 80s and 90s was very good, very unionized, and one could actually make a living doing nothing but voice work. Several things changed. The internet happened. Connections got faster over the internet, and you could pass more and more data. In the 80s, during the period of deregulation, Congress made it so that companies could own more and more radio stations in one market. Back in the early days when I was in radio, companies were held to the law, which was you can own one radio station, one TV station, and one newspaper station in a market. That's it. And in the, I guess it was in the 90s or after the 80s, when they were deregulated, there's a term in the housing industry called flipping, when you buy a house, fix it up really quickly, and then sell it.
Okay.
The same happened with TV and radio facilities in this country, and the prices were spiraling out of control, and it became not so much a buying and selling of properties as a game of hot potato, knowing that the last person who bought would be saddled with a purchase price that they could not hope to pay for. And that's what happened. The hot potato ended, the period ended, and then all of these owners of these radio stations that they were paying way too much for went crying to Congress saying, we can't make a living doing this unless you let us own more than one radio, one TV, and one newspaper in a marketplace. We're all going to die. Congress bent, that's kind of what happened. Clear Channel Broadcasting had, at that point, I think, owned almost 1,200 radio stations in this country. As I said earlier, the internet was ripe, big, and fat. So something called voice tracking happened. And voice tracking simply is, say the guy gets off at his air shift at 10 a.m. in Detroit.
Okay.
He goes and gets a cup of coffee and a cigarette and comes back, and at 10:30, he goes into a studio, and he has a handful of cards and a computer, and he does all the breaks for the afternoon show. And he hits a button on the internet, and all of these audio files fly across the internet to 3 or 4 of Clear Channel's smaller stations across the country. And so 3 or 4, however many stations that is, those people no longer need an afternoon drive person. So they fire him. So what does that afternoon drive person know how to do? Well, read cards and do hopefully a reasonably good radio show.